Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here. My name is Kat and I make houseplant videos here on Good and Planty. If you just so happen to absolutely love this video, please consider liking it, commenting, subscribing, or following me on Instagram. All of these things help me grow my channel like a plant. Today is all about the RHAPHIDOPHORA TETRASPERMA. I don't know if it's RHAPHIDOPHORA or RHAPHIDOPHORA, so please forgive me. I will probably be saying a mix of both just because I don't know what's correct. We are going to be talking about water, light, soil, propagation, fertilizing, all of that good stuff so that you can take the best care of your RHAPHIDOPHORA TETRASPERMA at home. I'm gonna pop up some time codes on the screen. I will have them linked in the description box, and any products that I mention will also be linked in the description box down below. This plant is actually commonly called the mini monstera, and that is because of the slits in its little leaves. I actually have a monstera here. You can see that it's a little bit similar with the slits. That was very convenient. Thank you. That is kind of where it gets its name from, but it is not a monstera. It belongs to the RHAPHIDOPHORA genus. I think a little bit less commonly it's called a philodendron ginny or guinea, and it is also not a philodendron, it is a RHAPHIDOPHORA. So the RHAPHIDOPHORA is the genus it belongs to, and then Tetrasperma is the species. These plants are toxic, so make sure to keep them away from any pets, because if they chew on them, you could have a little bit of a problem on your hands. And the one thing that I do want to mention briefly is tissue culture with these plants. These plants, I think, in 2019, but maybe also a little bit during 2020, got super popular, and the price just skyrocketed because there was just not enough supply to meet the demand, and you know, whatever, economics. Tissue culture allowed these plants to be mass produced and sort of made these plants a little bit more accessible and cheaper for people like you and me. I am not an expert in tissue culture. I barely just know the basics of how that works and what it is and everything. Plant tissue culture is a way to widely mass produce plants in a process called micro-propagation, I believe. I'm not even trying to get into it. Really, in short, it's just a way to mass produce plants, as I've said, and not need to grow them from seed. So it uses cloning or whatever, and produces a lot of plants, and then the plant is cheaper and more accessible for you and me. I do have a tissue culture plant, and you can usually tell by the leaf shape and the price. My plant was about $30 when I got her in a 4-inch pot, so a lot smaller than what you're seeing now. And this is her leaf shape. The difference is the original RHAPHIDOPHORA tetrasperma used to be a lot more expensive. I think that for the same size, you might have to spend around $100 on an original RHAPHIDOPHORA tetrasperma, but I think that the price has evened out a little bit. It's hard to say because it matters where you live, what time you are watching this video. So honestly, I don't think the price is a great indicator, but apparently there are differences in the leaf shape. I think that with the original RHAPHIDOPHORA tetrasperma, you can see that the slits are a little bit asymmetrical, whereas I think with the original, they line up a little bit better. I'm not an expert on that, but that's kind of what I've gathered. Apparently, if you grow out the tissue culture for long enough, you can kind of have leaves that resemble the natural variety a little bit more, but that's not a guaranteed thing. With this topic, there's a lot of strong opinions. At the end of the day, if you are a very casual plant hobbyist like me, the tissue culture is totally fine. I feel satisfied. My RHAPHIDOPHORA tetrasperma itch has been scratched, and I did not have to pay an absurd amount of money for it. That's just my very small 2 cents on the matter. I just wanted to mention it because I find it to be pretty interesting and definitely super significant to the history of this plant and what you might come across when you are researching this plant on your own. That's a very brief introduction to tissue culture and the history of the RHAPHIDOPHORA tetrasperma. Regardless of whether you have the TC or non-TC plant, this plant is considered to be pretty easy to grow, and honestly, I would recommend it for beginner growers. So now let's jump into the care of this plant, and I want to kick things off with water. Water for this plant, I think, is the hardest area of care, so I just want to get that out of the way and get you equipped with the proper knowledge. When you read about this plant, a lot of the advice is that this plant likes to stay slightly moist, which is definitely true. However, I do want to note that this plant can definitely be drought tolerant, and you can keep the soil a little bit on the drier side. I absolutely recommend doing that if you are a beginner to houseplant care, because it can be a little bit tricky walking that line of keeping your plants slightly moist and not soggy. It is always better to underwater than overwater. So if you're a little bit worried about keeping your soil at the correct moisture level, you can let the pot dry out quite a bit. Whoa! Before watering. Me, I try to keep the soil around the moisture level that is ideal for the plant, and typically that looks like at around a 3 on the moisture meter. Just make sure you're checking multiple spots within the pot, and then if you want to stay a little bit on the side of caution, you can water when the moisture meter is at around a 2. During the winter though, when this plant isn't growing as much, I do definitely keep it on the drier side, so that 2 on the moisture meter. If you are watering your plant too much, you will absolutely see root rot develop. If you want to know more about root rot, I have an entire video on it and how to treat it, so I will let you check it out. I'll link it up above. Basically, you'll see typical root rot signs like yellow leaves, a mushy base, black roots, all of that stuff. That's for overwatering. If you are underwatering this plant, at first you'll see some leaf drooping and some really soft leaves that are kind of like floppy. And then if you push the plant a little bit too far, you could see some leaf crisping and leaf loss. Now let's move on to light. This plant, as with a lot of other houseplants, likes bright indirect light. I live in the northern hemisphere. The ideal lighting situation for this plant would be eastern exposure, maybe western exposure if you can acclimate it to a little bit more of intense light, but nothing direct, please. My plant is under grow lights and it is super responsive to that. It really likes it. This is definitely a grow light friendly plant. If your plant is getting too much light, too direct light, you will see some bleaching color of the leaves, so the leaves will get a little bit of a lighter green, and you might notice some burn spots happening on the leaves. If the plant is getting too little light, this is not, in my opinion, a low light tolerant plant. So you'll see that there's a lot of space between the leaves. So I would say that this is a pretty healthy looking plant. There's like, I don't know, like an inch or 2 between each leaf. But if the plant is getting too little light, you'll definitely notice the vines getting a lot longer, a lot less leaves, and the leaves will probably not only be smaller, but not have these slits. If that happens, it's a quick fix. You can just propagate the legginess off the plant, which we'll talk about later, how to propagate, and you can just move the plant into more appropriate conditions and let it bounce back on its own. Soil and repotting. This plant definitely loves a chunky, airy soil mixture. This is the soil mixture I use for all of my plants and aeroids. If you haven't watched my soil video, sorry, I'm gonna link to a lot of videos probably here, but I do go in depth on the soil mixture I use. I'll pop the recipe briefly down here below. It doesn't mind having a little bit room to grow, so you don't have to suffocate the root ball in the pot, but just make sure that you are not drowning the plant in too much soil and promoting potential rot. If the soil stays too soggy for too long and the roots can't suck up all of that moisture, you know, that's when the root rot happens. That's why a well-draining mix is super important. This is a plant that loves to vine and climb up. They have aerial roots that pop out as it grows. It very clearly wants something to latch onto. You can have this be like a trailing down basket plant, but honestly, I really don't recommend it. I don't think it works as well as a pothos does vining down. I really recommend giving it a pole or a trellis of some sort to climb up. I think it'll be a lot happier that way, and you will get a lot healthier, bigger leaves. Humidity and temperature. This plant is a tropical plant, so it enjoys temperatures that are pretty comfortable for you and me. That's why it is is a great houseplant, and that looks like between 55-80 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're comfortable, your plant is probably comfortable is how I like to think of it. When it comes to humidity, ideally keep your plant in about 50 to 60% humidity, but again, it's pretty adaptable to regular house conditions, which can sit at like maybe 30% humidity. I did add a humidifier near where this plant grows, but all of this growth happened without a humidifier nearby. If you're noticing that the leaves while they're unfurling, so like the new leaves that come in, if they're getting stuck all rolled up like that, it might be a humidity issue or a watering issue. Fertilizer. These plants are quite fast growers and absolutely need some nutrition to replace what they're eating up in the soil. That's when fertilizer comes in. Currently, I am using liquider almost every time I water, maybe every other time. And technically, I guess that's not a fertilizer, that's more of like a plant nutritional food thing, but I just use it as a fertilizer. And so far I've been liking liquider. I also, for I think more of a majority of this plant's life, I used Espoma's all-purpose balanced, what is the word? Organic fertilizer. When I was using that, I would dilute it in some water, and I use that about bi-weekly. If you want to know more about fertilizing, I also have a whole in-depth video on the Espoma and Liquidirt methods that I've used, and you can go ahead and check that out. I'll link it up above. Apologies for sending you to all of these different videos, but I think that it would kind of like build a well-rounded look on plant care. That's kind of what I do for fertilizing. However, I will mention in this video, I don't fertilize in the winter. That might change with Liquidirt, because since Liquidirt is a plant food and it is so heavily diluted and so gentle, I think you might be able to use it during the winter time. I just haven't used Liquidirt during the winter yet, so it might get a little bit of year-round nutrition from me now. And last but not least, let's talk about propagation. Propagation with this plant is super easy. If you've propagated a pothos or vining philodendron before, it's a really similar concept. If you haven't, no worries, I'm gonna explain everything. There's really two ways that I would recommend propagating, and for both, you just wanna start with finding that node, which is the bulging part of the vine. You might even see a little aerial root starting to poke out, and making a cut about an inch or two below the node. I like all of my cuttings to have at least one leaf on them. Option one is to propagate in water. After you take your node cutting, you can go ahead and let that cutting callus for an hour or two. You just kind of want the edges to harden off a little bit so that it doesn't rot once you put it in water. Once that cutting has calloused, you can go ahead and put it in a little container of water. Only submerge the node in the water, and then you can go ahead and swap that water out at least once a week. Make sure that the node continues to be submerged throughout that week and that not too much water is evaporating. Option number two is to use sphagnum moss. All you do for that is take some dampened sphagnum moss. I can't say sphagnum moss. So you take your dampened moss and you take your cutting and bury the node just ever so slightly into that damp moss. Keep that moss damp for the whole duration of the propagation. I personally, and I know this is true for other people as well that have tried this little mini experiment, spag usually is more successful and faster and produces thicker roots than water propagating these plants. I don't know why. I will note that regardless of what option you choose, I've noticed that these propagations do a lot better in well-lit environments and environments that are more humid. I tend to keep my propagations in my little mini grow tent, and they are pretty successful that way. Also, regardless, for either method, you want the roots to get a few inches long so that it's pretty comparable to the cutting size. And then you can go ahead and pot up those cuttings in the well-draining soil that we talked about earlier. I personally like to keep that soil moist for about 2 weeks after transplanting. I also try to keep the plant in that well-lit, humid environment just so that it can acclimate to the new growing medium. Okay, so I think that's everything that I have on the RHAPHIDOPHORA tetrasperma. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have additional tips or any questions, please drop them down below in the comment section. I'll do my best to answer them. Please subscribe to my channel if you don't already and you want to see more planty content from me. Please like this video, comment down below, hit the notification bell, check out my merch maybe if you're feeling fancy, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!